Listening to Bad Dog Agility, bringing you training tips, interviews, and news about the great sport of dog agility.
I'm Jennifer.
I'm Esteban.
And I'm Sarah, and this is episode 256. Today's podcast is brought to you by hititboard.com. Hititboard.com has the innovative training tools you need for agility. Having problems with the dog walk or A-frame? The HitItBoard can fix that. Your dog doesn't like tugging? They'll love the Tug It. Can't move your A-frame around by yourself? The Move It can. Go to hititboard.com and use discount code BDA10 to get 10% off your order. That's hititboard.com. Today we have a proofing checklist for your dog agility, and we're going to talk about proofing in general and different things to think about when you're proofing, but we also have a download that you can download from the show notes for this episode, and it will have a list of proofing ideas for your dog agility. So when we talk about proofing, we are talking about adding distractions to your training that help your dog both deal with distractions they're going to see in the ring and in real life, but also strengthen their understanding of their job.
Yeah, I think about it as almost kind of a test of their understanding, not a test in a way that I'm trying to trick them or I'm trying to get them to fail. It's like, I think of it, it's almost like a multiple choice. Like I'm going to give you options. Are you going to make the right choice? I'm going to make things harder for you. Do you really have a clear understanding of that? And that's really what we're looking at here.
Yeah, I think that's so important because we often reach a point in training where the dog can kind of do whatever it is we want. Like for example, the weave pulls. They may not necessarily be very confident. We don't really do any proofing. And then we expect that same behavior in the show environment. And that's just not going to happen. And we often see the most difficult, complex behaviors break down first, like weave pulls, like the stopped contact performance at the end of, the dog walk or the A-frame or the teeter, and they break down very quickly.
Right. And I think of distractions as being kind of in two different categories. One category is there are distractions your dog is going to have in the ring that they have to be able to work around those distractions. They need to be able to work around barking dogs in the background, around another person in the ring besides you, they need to be able to perform when you are running and when you add motion. And all of these are distractions to the behavior, but they're also kind of part of doing that behavior in the agility context. But I think that we can also use distractions by challenging our dogs in practice, challenging them to an extremely high level so that then when they do encounter those lesser distractions in the ring, they have all of this confidence in their choices and in their ability to perform.
Yeah, I years ago, came from an obedience background, and we would do some really kind of that extreme proofing and doing things that you would not see in a trial. They're not ever going to happen, but kind of that idea that if you can do this, you can do that. And the one that was always ingrained in me, being younger and kind of just stuck with me, is Diane Bauman wrote a book and would put a turtle in the middle of the scent articles, and would work her dog doing the scent articles with a live turtle in the middle. Are you ever going to see that in a trial? Absolutely not. But if your dog can do scent articles with a turtle, your dog can do scent articles in a trial, a milder trial situation when they're not there. So that kind of extreme category is, I think, what a lot of people think of as proofing, that going above and beyond. But that first part about just actually training through the distractions that are realistic to a trial, I know that for me in classes, we often forget to practice with ring crew in there. You mentioned about being able to do it those trial settings. And sometimes I think for me, my brain defaults to those extremes. Let's wrap the weave poles in a different material, wrap them in tinfoil, wrap them in bubble wrap. Can your dog weave? But then I'll go through an entire year of training with a novice group of dogs and forget to have them practice ring crew in the ring. And then they go to a trial and they get distracted. So I think it's a really great point that you bring up about kind of these two different stages. I don't know that you want to call them categories, but these kind of different stages of proofing, kind of the realistic distractions that are going to happen at a trial and kind of the extreme. So that's a great point that you bring up.
And I think that when we look at proofing and when we work with students, I think the vast majority of students understand that they need to add proofing to their training. And so it's something that they're going to do. But I think that the vast majority of people have kind of a limited set of things that they might proof against, and then they're kind of out of ideas. And so we wanted to tape this podcast to give you a lot of examples, a lot of ideas, and have this PDF download for you so that you have many, many, many different ways that you can go and challenge your dog. And we do a lot of this in our training and with people that are part of our program. We do what we call challenges, right? Where we set up something extreme and see, can your dog do this or not? And it's about learning what your dog can do, learning what is most distracting to them, but then also working through that. And so in doing that, we have different kind of categories of distractions that we will work through. So, for example, especially for dogs that are in position, like a start line or a stop contact, we will do things like handler motion movement distractions. Some of these are things that you're probably not going to do in the ring. Like we will have people do jumping jacks next to their dog while they're in a start line stay. That is probably not something that you're going to do in the ring. But another thing that we will have people do is just raise their arm, as many people do when they lead out. They lead out, they raise their arm, and as soon as they raise their arm, their dog breaks. So this is a very common proofing thing. We will have the double lead out. This one is classic for getting dogs to break a start or to break a contact. And that is, these dogs know that they have to hold position, and you blow past the contact and they hold the start line stay. You stop, they're stopped. But as soon as you start moving again, they break again. So we will have people go run past the contact, the dog successfully stops, the handler stops, and then have the handler run again without releasing the dog. That's another good movement one. Doing a sudden jolt where you suddenly start to run again versus just taking that one step forward. That could be how you could progress through that.
Bending down and touching the ground is always a good one. You're often not going to be running in a trial and bending down and touching the ground. But two things. One, what if your shoe becomes untied? Your dog's in that 2 on 2 off. You want to bend down and tie your shoe, or why the dog is on the pause table. I've done that. The judge is counting. Okay, let me tie my shoe really quick. So that one. But number two, that one's tough because what do we do with puppies? What's kind of the international come to me? A dog is lost, or you find a dog that doesn't want to recall, or a puppy. What do? We bend down, boop, 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 or we lower our body to invite the dog in. So on start lines and contacts, that's a really good one to proof, is to bend down. That will get a lot of dogs in my classes. And a kind of advanced version, bend down and tap the ground. A lot of them, when you touch that ground, they think you're pointing at a treat or you're pointing for something that they can come sniff. So that's another good one with regard to kind of motion, similar to the jumping jacks. You might not need it, but the jumping jacks might be the extreme of raising the arm, like the bending down and touching the ground might be the extreme of having to tie your shoe.
Yeah, another great example that you just made me think of when I thought about practical things, like what might you need to do, right? I think one distraction that gets a lot of dogs is disconnecting. So you're not looking at the dog. The dog is in a start line stay or at the bottom of a stop contact, and you look away from the dog to look out at the course. Well, how many of you have at some point when you were running suddenly had a blank on what was next on course? You get to the table and you're like, oh, what is the next jump? And you need to use that 5 seconds to look out over the course. This is a prime time for your dog to break when you disconnect, because that disconnect is almost like a lot of dogs use it as almost permission. They're like, well, if you're not paying attention to me anymore, maybe what I'm doing doesn't matter anymore. So proofing them to you being able to look out over the course is another great practical proofing exercise that you can do.
Mm-hmm. I think these are all really good. For start lines, I really focus on things that I'm going to run into at a trial. And there's a couple of other big things to think about. Number one is delays. So think about all the different delays that you're going to have if you're the first dog on the line, or the dog in front of you, runs out of the ring and the handler needs to go and get them. Mostly the judge is going to be fixing equipment. That's often a good time to do things. And actually in a trial situation, you can do some of your proofing right there. And that's one of the really useful things about proofing, is some of that can be introduced in the trial environment before your run. You can't do it during your run because there are judges who will excuse you. By rule, you are not allowed to train in the ring. So it depends on the judge's interpretation of that rule. So conversation with the judge, I think, is always a good one. So I like to lead out and then look around, like you were saying, and then talk to someone. So I'll station someone out there and then have a conversation with them. Or I'll point as if I'm pointing to a jump to say, go and set that bar. The bar is not set correctly, or the bar is not set there, or please check the tire height. So things that I might do in a real trial, I make sure that I can do that in a practice situation first. And I think a lot of people who work with better trainers in a live setting have had some exposure to this, where their instructor pretends to be the judge. They come over very close to the table count and they do a loud 5 and 4 and 3 and 2. And then when they get to go, they're like, and go. That's the kind of high level proofing, and judges isn't going to necessarily do that. But there's some judges who count very loudly or say go very emphatically.
Or they're on a loudspeaker.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think those are really good things that are very specific to the start line. But the start line is, your control position behavior, as are your stop contacts. So table, teeter, dog walk, A-frame, anywhere you have a stop contact, this is going to be very helpful. And you should be doing these same proofs every single time, in my opinion.
Exactly. So moving on from the handler distractions, so things that the handler is doing that would be considered distracting to the dog.
Well, let me interrupt you and let's make the next one the environment, trial environment, because you just mentioned the loudspeaker. So I think that there are some environments that are very specific to the dog. I think of proofing on different surfaces. So a lot of people don't think about that because they don't really have access to other surfaces. But I know that if I'm running on a dirt show and I do all of my training on grass in my backyard and my practice field is all grass, my weekly class, then, my dog is not going to do great on dirt. And so at the very least, you want to get access to the warm-up jump and run through all your stuff there. And that is a form of proofing. Can you do a wrap? Can you do a backside? Can you jump an extension? Can you collect on this surface? And there are going to be surfaces that your dog, they don't like to sit on. So how many of you have run into a situation? I'm thinking for me, it would be like a muddy trial where the dog doesn't want to sit. You have one of those breeds.
Are you kidding me?
Sitting? Yeah. So, very, I don't know what the right word is. Dogs that like to be neat and not sit in certain spots can be like that. Jen, can you think of situations similar to that?
Oh, yeah. I see it, I guess not so much anymore, but the pause table, like when you have the rubber versus the painted sand. Mm-hmm. Because we have rubber, I can think of one student particularly, and it was a hairless breed. It was a little IG, and putting her elbows down on a harder, just the plyboard with sand. She was like, no, I can't cope with this. So it's not just the surface on the start line, although that is a huge one. Here we have mostly AstroTurf in Ohio. So people will make a big deal about shows on dirt. So when Nationals comes around, you'll see a lot of local horse arenas. People will go rent them and take their jumps because they want to make sure that not only dealing with the surface, but making sure the dog's not going to sniff, or, making sure that they have to jump out of now a 1/4 inch softer surface than what they're used to on the AstroTurf. So, we're kind of spoiled in that regard. And the year I went to EO, oh my gosh, I was training for months outside because I had such a hard time running outside. That's more of a surface podcast than proofing. But yeah, switching that surface and adjusting that surface, whether it be the running surface or the differences in the equipment. Most everything I think is rubberized these days. But you're even just that we've seen recently all the changes with solid color poles.
Right. Oh yeah.
Now we're getting off track to other environmental changes, but changes in the equipment and different facilities having different color poles. So proofing that at home by being able to cope with a large variety of weave pole colors. I know we have them at my facility in colors now. I think just because we want to rotate through and, every couple weeks we'll switch just to kind of get the dogs used to, hey, they're not always going to be, red and blue or whatever colors that you're going to have. So certainly kind of the environment, the surface, equipment, all goes into play.
Yeah, and I think that for a lot of people, that kind of training with an established dog, people often think about they're really trying to get the best performance out of their dog, right? So they want their dog to, quote, adjust to the surface. But I want to point out for people with young dogs or inexperienced dogs, or if you are new to a sport, these are the kind of changes that in the learning phase with a dog that isn't very far in their agility training, it's not just a matter of them adjusting. They no longer know the behavior. So, for instance, you might go from turf to dirt with your weave poles, which you are in the middle of teaching. And in fact, we had somebody just bring this up the other day. Dog was perfect on 6 poles in the driveway, moved the poles to the grass, and the dog, it completely fell apart. It's not just that they need to adjust, it completely fell apart. And so these proofing ideas, it's not just about giving the dog exposure. You may have to, in a sense, kind of retrain some of your behaviors in these different places, different surfaces, different environments, and make it a little bit easier for your dog while they work through this new level of distraction.
Yeah,
that example. Yeah, that example I think is huge. We see that using the weave poles because the dogs will feed off of the bases. So the base is on turf, they're paying attention to that. You get it in grass and it's now sunk down and they have to focus on poles. So, there's a lot of factors to take into account. And those changes are good to be doing all along. Don't necessarily, if you think that's another part of proofing is I do feel like people will want to wait until they have a finished product to begin to proof. And talking about weave poles and kind of going through that recently, I've been teaching my young Sheltie Vento to weave. And I made sure my goal was to do 5 2-minute sessions in a day. And I really tried hard that every time I did a session, I tried to change the location, or at least the orientation in the facility. So I would do session 1 and 2 at my building, and then I would do session 3 or 4 at home in the grass, and then session 5, in the garage. And so I think like using, again, the weave poles as an example, people say, well, I'm going to get my weave poles perfect. So they'll only do them in their front yard and they're keeping the orientation the same. They never change the location, and they get up to 12 poles and they think, great, I've got 12 poles. Now let's proof. Well, you've already kind of missed the opportunity for some of that proofing along the way because they're going to go do them in the backyard instead of the front yard, and the dog's going to have a major adjustment, or you're going to take them from your yard to your training facility. So I think there's a lot of proofing that can be done as part of the process to help the dog generalize along the way, so that then when you do change things like the location of your weave poles, it's already been there throughout the learning process. So now I'm finding that with Vento, because I changed the location, when I go somewhere else, I actually went to a friend's place and I asked him to do some weave poles. He was like, okay, I can do this, because we'd already been outside. We'd already been inside. One session to another, I would change. Instead of going this way, we would be weaving going this way, or being parallel to my pole barn, I would be perpendicular to the pole barn, so that he was adjusting to all these things. I would change the colors of the weave poles almost every couple days. So we would do blue ones, and then we would do red ones, and then we would do white ones with stripe. And the weave poles are a good example, but people can be doing this with all aspects of their training. And I think the idea that proofing doesn't have to happen when the product is finished might be a new concept for people. They think that proofing, and even I said it, it's a form of testing. So they think, well, don't test the dog until you feel like you've taught the behavior. And maybe that was bad verbiage on my part, thinking about it more as mild proofing throughout the training process helps the dog generalize and makes those changes in environment, or changes in equipment, or changes in handler more common and more approachable. Even if I made sure to do, this seems really odd maybe to some people, but I made sure to do some of my sessions wearing a hat. And I actually went out and did a session where I was wearing sunglasses. It happened to be that, I was outside, so it was convenient, but it was a conscious choice to say, let me make sure he can do it with me having that hat on. If it wasn't so hot out, you could do like wearing a raincoat. Right. That I remember back showing outdoors. Again, we're spoiled in Ohio. We haven't done that in years. But like the judge was wearing a raincoat with their hood up. Dogs were totally wigging out about that. So as a handler, I try to make sure that the dog is comfortable with me wearing a hat, comfortable with me wearing sunglasses. And that's all just happening as I was doing 2x2s. I didn't wait until the end to do that.
Right. Exactly. That's a fantastic point. Adding those distractions all along. I think about, our puppies, and even when all we were doing was teaching them to sit, or down, we're immediately, as soon as they're holding that behavior at all, we're starting to add some mild distractions, some moving around. And, I was thinking about this in anticipation of this podcast, and I was thinking, when you introduce these distractions right away, the distractions actually become a cue for the dog to continue holding their behavior, right? Like I think that it's actually harder to have a dog sit, for example, and then to sit there and count to 30 and do absolutely nothing, right? Like that is a harder distraction for the dog than starting to add in these like hand motions. It's almost like it gives the dog something to focus on or something to see. So you add a little, I will usually, my first distraction usually is like waving my arms, right? So I have the dog sit and then I just wave my arms, and before they even have a chance to react, I'm rewarding, right? And then adding the distraction actually increases the duration all by itself, right?
Yeah.
So like the time it takes for me to wave my arms is time. And then I can wave my arms longer and longer and longer. And then it's kind of almost a more advanced proofing thing to see. And now I'm waving my arms and then I stop, or I don't wave my arms at all. And can you still sit there and pay attention? So I think sometimes people do it the opposite way. They try to just go for time. Right? They just go for like time, duration, rather than adding the distractions and then letting the dog learn that these distractions are just part of it.
Yeah, I've kind of become the poster child for that one in a comical way with my, as you guys know, my running out on my start line, waving my arms and jumping up and down. Even at the World Championships, that video that went around, like, what is going on? This is the World Championships. And she's proofing her dog and trying to get Swift to come off the start line. And it's because, that's become a kind of our thing. And the more I try to sort of proof him and give him distractions, he's like very focused on a start line. Like, oh, okay. But if I were to just like stop and look at him or talk or count to 30, I know he'd be like, wait, did you forget about me? Should I go now?
Right.
So I mean, the stopping and doing nothing is what I need to work on, because I did so much of that proofing. And we had a Halloween show, and somebody dressed as me and I dressed as them. And their joke was when we ran our dogs like them. And that was the joke. They were running out on the start line, flailing their arms, because that's kind of become my thing. So when you were talking about that, it made me laugh. Yeah. So I'm like, yep, I got that one under control.
But it works. And I call it putting the dog into proofing mode, right? They immediately know that, you were trying to trick me into moving, and I shall not be tricked, lady.
I mean, ultimately it goes, it falls on reinforcement, right? There's differential reinforcement in those two situations, and the dog kind of teases that out. And you run into this a lot because there are going to be a lot of people who tell you stories like this. When I lead out really slowly and I'm looking at the dog and I say, wait, and I hold my hands up, my dog always breaks. But when I just walk out there and I just turn my back on my dog and I ignore them and I act like they're going to stay, then they do stay. Right. They don't really understand that it has to do with how they choose to reinforce or not reinforce their dog. But, and they themselves, the handlers, become very superstitious in their thinking about what makes the dog sit
Right, exactly.
So, yeah. So pretty interesting.
All right. Well, let's get through some more examples of distractions for people, and then we'll wrap up this podcast. We've hit a lot of the high-level things that I wanted to make sure we got to, including adding those distractions early in your training. But we want to add object distractions. So we will add what we call dead toys, which means there is a toy there, but it's not moving or anything. So this can be done on your stop contacts, but this can also be done in things that have movement. So you could have toys placed around the weave poles. You could have toys lying around near the tunnel that the dog has to run by as they are doing the obstacle. And if you have a dog that's more food motivated, that might not be very difficult, but can you put an empty food bowl out there and expect your dog to run past it? So these are like some object things you can add. We will work up to actual thrown toys where they see the movement of the toy, but they have been given a job to do, like take the tunnel or do the weaves or run in contact, and they're expected to do that job and not go get the thrown toy unless cued.
I think you need to be careful with objects that you put out there, because handlers might trip on them, but I would do things like leave a hammer out there. I would wad up a piece of duct tape and leave that out there. I would have something that might resemble a little camera, and I would put it out there.
Good one.
We run into situations in your head. You want to think Westminster, and there's going to be situations where you put in all this hard work, or tryouts. I remember when they had at an indoor hockey arena, and the dogs just couldn't get used to the echoing that they could hear in a indoor sports facility, or hockey pucks banging off the walls, or soccer balls banging off the walls. And, there are just things you're going to know you'll run into. I would take a big old VHS camcorder that doesn't actually work, and have one of your other students tape a student who's running, and, come up when they're on the start line, come up, like a foot or two away, as if they were doing, how they do the cameras on.
Right, exactly.
That's if you're specifically going to those events, but, it's just kind of know your environment and what the dog is going to be seeing there. And then you'll be okay, because we'd have shows like at Reliant. And I'm sure you have a big cluster show up in Ohio as well, where you have spectators and kids eating hot dogs and things like that.
Well, I was just going to say things outside the ring. I had several dogs worry when Ethan was younger, and I would bring him in with a stroller. Totally react with a stroller. So, you're not going to be in the ring with a stroller, but there might be one right outside, or
Absolutely.
A wheelchair. Somebody, even if it's not moving,
crutches,
just if it looks different,
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of object things. You really got to think big picture on that, and not just, I think sometimes people think specific to their show site. Or, if people show at Incredipaws and that's their main place, they're only thinking about that. But you go outside of that, and you're gonna be presented with some different challenges that you never proofed for. So trying to really cover your bases.
And I think the more that we show our dogs, the more they get about distractions in general, right? And so even though you've done 3 or 4 or 5 of these, like how many can you do? And you can do umbrellas, I think, is another good one, because it is such a bizarre looking thing. And this was one of the challenges that we did with our students. And people were really surprised that some advanced dogs, just when the umbrella was really close to the weave poles, they're like, nope, not going anywhere near that thing. And they had to let the dog investigate the umbrella, and then they were able to work through it.
I bet British dogs do much better with umbrellas than American dogs.
Probably dogs in Seattle.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Right. So hats, umbrellas are good things to put out there. You want to think about sounds. So as you mentioned, the loudspeakers. I think a voice that is recorded it sounds different to dogs than a real voice, right? So you could even record yourself and play it on your phone or your iPad or whatever. You could play music, clapping, like people are going to be clapping.
Music with a big booming bass.
Big booming bass will get dogs that are thunderphobic, and it is something that you will see at trials. We would have people, bang on pots and pans. And the nice things about these soundproofing is if it bothers your dog, you just make it really, really quiet. and then work up the volume. And that's usually going to be a way to be able to work through progressive type of sounds.
Because how many of you know dogs that you're like, man, I hope nobody claps for us because then my dog's going to freak out. Or the dog gets a great run, and then when everyone's clapping at the end, the dog like bolts.
Right.
Yeah, that happens a lot at big events.
Right.
So I think clapping is one. I like to do that as a distraction. When dogs are weaving, the pretend judge can be clapping when they're on the table, and clap in different patterns, certainly.
Yeah, and I think that handling distractions, like being ahead, being behind, being lateral, we think of that as handling, but it is also a form of proofing. And I think of weave poles and contacts because, at least to me, they feel like they have the opposite problem. So I feel like for a lot of dogs, lack of motion in the weave poles is easier for them than motion, right? They go and they find that entry and they can really concentrate on what they're doing. But when you start adding a lot of running as they're still trying to find their entry, that's when they miss the entry. So you have to work up to that motion. And then I think of contacts as kind of the opposite, right? The dogs become pretty dependent on the handler running on the contact, and they can no longer perform the contact when the handler is hanging back. And so these kind of how much forward motion, how much hanging back, how much lateral distance that you have, these are all also proofing items.
And all your crosses too, blind crosses, front crosses, kind of going back to that connection. I'll see some dogs that are great on a front cross at the end of a contact because the handler can keep eye contact. And they step across for a blind and you turn your head and they're off. Or rear crossing up a contact, as you just mentioned, particularly the teeter can be tough because now you're pulling back, you're behind the dog. So they don't want to drive down or go to the end. So even just making sure that you can do all obstacles with all crosses and then different degrees, blinding on a soft turn where you're really only turning, 45 degrees off the line might be different than a 360 degree front cross where there's a lot more rotation on the handler's body. So working through the different types of motion and those different types of crosses.
Mm-hmm. I think one other little sneaky one, now that I think of one, is dogs coming out of the tunnel. With experience, they'll learn to locate you based on where you were when they went in. But the rookie dogs don't do this very well. So in their minds, until they kind of figure it out, the before and the after part is just kind of magical to them. And so one thing that can happen is the judge can be you, right? They come out, they are looking forward, they see the judge to the left, you're on the right, and the judge is who they saw first. They assume that's you, right? That you've magically teleported like you do in practice all the time, and they turn the wrong way. They turn toward the judge, or they look at the judge, or they go wider, because it takes a stride or two before they realize that's not you, that's some other person that I'm not going to follow. So until dogs kind of figure that out, that's something to think about. And so I will throw that in to practice as well.
Oh, that's a really good one. Yep, absolutely. All right. So we have given you a ton of ideas, and my hope for this podcast is that you go away and you never again feel like you have run out of proofing ideas. Be creative. Don't just limit yourself to things that you are going to see. Definitely.
Don't scare your dog though. If your dog has fearful reaction, don't do that proof.
Or work up to it. Like, you have to be smart, but the point is you should do it, and you should incorporate it into kind of your entire dog's career, not just as the finished product.
We play a game in class called Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better. And you challenge your friends. So like if you feel like you're running out of ideas, get one of your friend involved, and they'd be like, "Ooh, I ran down and did 2 push-ups." And then they're like, "Yeah, but can you do it where you throw the dead squirrel in front of them, or whatever?" And like get some ideas. Get some ideas from your friends, So I'm with you. You should not be running out of ideas. We've given you a ton here. You play a game with your friends, get some ideas from them, and you'll have a ton of suggestions and things to go out and do.
Yeah, the bottom line here is if your dog is barely doing the behavior and you have to do it just right and run a very specific way and stand in just this place and not that place, and your voice has to be this loud and not that loud, then you haven't done the proofing required for that behavior to be successfully done by your dog in the trial setting.
Absolutely. And that's it for this week's podcast. We'd like to thank our sponsor, hititboard.com. Happy training.
What do you call a dog magician? A labracadabrador.